Great, thank you so much. I'm speaking to James L. Watson, or Woody, who is Professor Emeritus of Chinese Society and Anthropology at Harvard University. We're talking today about his paper, Pigs from the Ancestors, Cantonese Ancestral Rites, Pork Division, and the Gender Revolution.
Yeah.
Hello, Woody.
The word salad, the title. I'm sorry about that.
It's brilliant. It's so brilliant. And thank you so much for joining me and taking the time out to talk about your paper, which was fascinating, so rich, very evocative. So I thought I'd dive right into my first question, Woody, which is, what's the central question that you sort of, pick apart or address in your paper?
I think the central question is what's happened to these clearly very old. I'm not going to call them ancient because by Chinese standards, that's going back thousands of years as opposed to hundreds. But these are rituals that clearly originated in South China, probably has connections to the pre-Han subcultures that they encountered in this region. Because some of these rites, if you read carefully about pork division and pork rituals and pigs, goes all the way down to New Guinea and up into South China. So the history is lost in the mist of time, and I don't plan to try to pursue their origins. But to me, as an outsider, it's patently obvious that these are not classic Han Chinese rituals that were brought down from North China. These were original rites that were then transmogrified, transformed by interaction in the local culture and became part of Cantonese and other subdialect groups in South China, but primarily the Cantonese celebrated them in the most Baroque fashion. And at some point, I suppose some historian might want to look into the historical origins. I only can examine what I saw and what I envision has happened. So I've been following these rites since the very first week that I began my field research over 50 years ago. It's over half a century. It's ridiculous. In which I first saw these rites and encountered them. And I described them in the paper and my reactions. And I've been transfixed by them ever since, I have to admit. I tortured my graduate students and my undergraduate students for decades in multiple universities, especially Harvard, with my photos and analysis of these rituals. And I counted once, and I have 2,876 photos.
Incredible.
At least.
Wow.
that I kept in my scanned archives, all of which have been scanned on high density scans, which I will then bequeath to archives at some point.
Wonderful.
And all of my graduate students quietly moan to themselves when I bring up this topic, because they've seen maybe not 2,800 of them, but they've seen perhaps 800 of them.
Wow.
And so it's a big joke among graduate students. But of course, we all enjoyed them. I have to admit they did too. Because these are really strikingly amazing images that I would like someday to publish a set of photo essays on this ritual system itself, which I have. Only a few of them are in the paper that you've seen. But the theme is more what I witnessed over the half century of the meaning and the performance of these rituals. And the big issue, of course, is women and the emergence of women as people, as humanoids that have roles to play in the larger society and in the local community. Because when my wife Ruby and I first encountered these villages, women had their own very separate ritual life, which Ruby is still writing about and has plans to finish writing. And men had their ritual system. I went off every morning with the men and spent my time with elders. And Ruby went off, was taken up by the older women and just disappeared into their world. And Ruby encountered things that were totally amazing to men when our younger meaning friends in the village who were our age, who are now like us, great grandparents and creaky people, We sit around and laugh now when we see each other about what it was like in those days. But the women had their subculture and the men had theirs. And they weren't even subcultures. They were cultural systems that almost did not overlap. And Ruby would come back after a long day of research, and maybe one or two of our male friends our age would be sitting in the house, and we'd be drinking tea or something. And Ruby would describe what the women were doing. And these guys, these men, would sit there with their gaping mouths open, like, what? They were doing what? They never heard, they had no idea of what the women were doing. They had totally different subculture. And so Ruby has got to write that up, and she's beginning to get it organized. And so that's the next part of these studies. My perspective had been, until recently, in the recent just decades or so, the perspective of men, because that's all who would ever talk to me. If I tried to talk to a woman, they would say, "Oh yeah, Sikjopan mea," and that sort of thing, just in Cantonese, just small talk, and wouldn't treat me like I was hardly a human because I was male, and I couldn't understand anyway. So why bother? Just go away. And it was just striking. So the paper is about the merging of younger women in the diaspora of this one lineage, and how women are now not just playing a part, but are actively kind of almost taking over the system and transforming it. And I want to keep track of it if possible.
You've done this really, the paper's so successful in the way that you juxtapose two periods. So you obviously had your long-term field work in the late 60s and in 1970, and the paper picks up on your observation of this ritual, of the New Year's ritual, and then the tomb visit later on in that year in 1970. Yeah. And then you juxtapose that brilliantly with a visit that you took to the same village. Although I guess it's not necessarily, I guess maybe not a village anymore, but you go to the same town, you partake in the same tomb visit in 2009, and so you pick up the story in 2009, and this is where you witness, I think, and I think it has been going on. You touch upon visiting the same area in the 80s and 90s, but in 2009. That's when you're struck with the number of women who visit as well. The fact that families picnic near the tomb, and so it feels much more of a family rite than it is of about a celebration of patrilineal, patrilocal traditions, right? Yeah, it's brilliantly, that this sort of long-term fieldwork, you can see how it does build a picture of a generational change, significant generational change, especially in the gender dynamics.
Yeah, I have to confess that, as it shows in the opening of that paper, how I was just gobswalloped. I was just whacked in the face. And I was just flabbergasted when I went out there out to see the tomb, which I'd seen many times. And everything about it was just mind warping, is the only way to describe it. I had a kind of weird, out of place experience. And I was wondering, where in God's name am I? And what is going on here? Because it was so strikingly, bizarrely different from what I just assumed Cantonese village life was like, and what the rituals were, which I knew a lot about. So I'm still trying to come to grips with that shock that I encountered. And of course, I shouldn't have been, because I had been working in London. I lived in London. I'd been around, and I saw what had happened with women who were coming from the village, and daughters-in-law. And others, and I could see that they were playing parts in the community right of overseas Chinese, overseas in London, but I didn't realize how much it had affected the entire ritual and social life as well. I should have, but I didn't.
It's brilliant. The way that you. I guess you show the antecedents of that change, as you say, in the diaspora, daughters and wives, and their increasing role in restaurants, and in economic and social life in Toronto, in Europe, etc. And so, and they themselves then organize visits back to celebrate the new year, to do, to take part in rituals. It's largely the women who end up facilitating this return, isn't it? It's
the women have basically pretty much taken control of things. And the men still are front and center in some of the rituals, but it doesn't take long for the women to kind of, move in, and it was. But what struck me too was that the men, except for one or two of my old friends who were my age and a bunch of old geezers like me, would say we were kind of standing on the side, and I could see one of my old friends was having trouble, and I didn't say anything to him, but it was clear that he thought this was strange too and unsettling. But nobody else did. None of their kids by that time were in their 50s, and dare I say it, 55-year-old quote kids and people like that were there they were in control of it, both men and women. So only us old guys on the side. And I mentioned in the conclusion of the paper that one or two of my old friends had what I thought were tears in their eyes, but that's just my imagination, because it was a dusty day and everything. But they were clearly affected like me, and they were sitting there. We were kind of standing by each other, looking at all of this as the women were performing these rituals. And I was just thinking of my old friends who've been gone, some of them for almost half a century, who would have seen this and what they would have thought. And I do think that they would be pleased that the tomb was still there, the rituals were being performed, and something was happening a half a century after their demise, and it was still going on. I have to think that. But here I am getting into personal interpretation, and us anthropologists don't do that, do we? We stick to the facts.
Oh, sure, the objective facts. Yeah,
we try.
Of course,
people of my generation do anyway. So, that's. But there's one part of the paper that I haven't put in yet, and I have to add a note of some type, and that is that when Ruby and I were living in those villages from the 60s and the 70s, Hong Kong and all of South China was coming through the post-war period of shortages. And until that point, meat was a real rarity. People didn't eat meat very often, and the only meat that they ate would have been at these rituals. And if you were not a member of a lineage like this, or a community that had these kind of rituals, you didn't eat meat for like years. And I encountered many villagers in so-called satellite villages or tenant villages throughout this region, and interviewed people about their diet. And people would launch themselves into long diatribes, especially the women, going on and on about, we didn't eat meat for 3, 4, 5 years. I didn't taste lard for 2 years because of the shortages, and it's horrible. And then one woman I remember distinctly saying, can you imagine what it's like to go through life and not taste lard in your life? And it was like there was nothing, no food, no meat. They lived on gruel and sweet potatoes and whatever else they could, and fish, but fish didn't count. That wasn't me.
Interesting.
And, so I'm now, I have to add that to the paper, that what happened is that we moved into these communities during a period of early boom, in which all of a sudden they had access to meat, and they went bonkers. There were pork divisions everywhere. There were pigs all over the place being chopped up. And it was just amazing when I look back at how that dominated the social and ritual life. But if I had been there 10 years earlier, 40 years earlier, it would have been very different. And it would have been so rare that only a few elders would have had a scrawny pig out by the graves. It would have still been there, but not like it was when I encountered it, these photos and everything.
It does. The interesting detail. There's so many interesting details in your paper, but the photo of the shares as they've been butchered, they've been sort of properly butchered and weighed and measured by the butcher and the accountant, and they're sort of on a reed mat. And then you describe what each share comprises. And actually it's quite a lot of meat. So I can see
it was a lot. It is a lot.
Yeah, I mean, even in the 70s. So the idea that actually you're observing this in a boom period, it does come across.
It's clear they had a surplus of meat, because that's a lot of meat. In the past, they would have been lucky to get just little bits of that, probably.
Amazing.
They still would have gotten the shares, the chopped up shares, but it would have been very small.
Significantly less, yeah.
I mean, women wouldn't have got any at the leftovers after they cooked it. I don't think so.
I mean, what strikes me is that it's very much nose to tail, from the snout to the tail, literally.
They ate it all.
And so it was the women that then, so the men collected the shares, the women then processed this into meals in the household, and then the males were served first. And you describe, the fact that pork, the meat itself, and especially after the tomb visits, the flesh is kind of empowered with the power of the ancestors, right? So what happens is, you place, especially with the tomb visits, you place the roast pork at this stage in the tombs of the ancestors, so that the bones of the ancestors can then infuse the flesh with the right kind of power for luck, good fortune, to have more male offspring. So it's the males that end up eating first and eating the most, presumably, of this pork flesh. How is the commensality? Has commensal relations changed then do you know if there's been a change in the way that meat is then redistributed in the household nowadays, once the pig is, the roast pig is taken apart?
I think that these rituals are still occurring, but in very truncated form. And for one thing that's clear to me from my recent visits and last few visits was that people were becoming health conscious, especially younger people, and especially young women who there was another set of rituals that I did not describe. And that's what's known as punchoi, meaning shared pots of food. And when I first went there, and I've written about this in another set of essays, every scrap of meat and fat and lard and everything was gobbled up by everyone, including the men and then women afterwards. And the only thing that was left were the few bones that the dogs would get. When I went back in the 2020s, in the 20s to the 2000s, meat was being left behind. People were not eating it. Young women wouldn't eat it even if they were presented with it, because it was, quote, too fattening. And so, and even the dogs got tired of it and would just walk away from it. I thought, my God, you're going to be kidding me. These county village watchdogs were replaced now with nice little, poodle type pooches that were too delicate to eat this stuff. And I, my God, what's going on? And the meat was just basically wasted. But this rituals still occurred. And I think that's part of what explains the picnic aspect of the rituals at the tomb that I described. People like to have a few pieces, just a little bit of roast pork, because it's actually quite good by any standards, but not very much. And they're conscious of their diet and such, so that one or two pigs will last for the entire assemblage. In the past, there would have been a dozen pigs, and people would have been fighting for a little bit. Ruby, by the way, has written an article about how within the lineages and within the sublineages, people squabbled over 2 or 3 ounces of pork, whether you get 2 ounces or 1 ounce or not. And the big disputes occurred over that. And now their great grandchildren would have thought that was the strangest thing. So
Brilliant.
There's just so many things going on in these rituals that I find it difficult to stay on track and not go off on a sideline, charge off on diet or, history of diet, or charge off on gender relations. I wanted it to stick to the core, which is the rites at the tomb and the rites in the ancestral hall.
I was going to ask you the way how you feel your research resonates with other research in the field, and it strikes me that you pick up on briefly in your paper about the fact that some of these the people who perform these rites, they become, if you like, ritual specialists especially for the Man villages that were on the other side of the border of the Hong Kong China border in Dongguan. And you mentioned that a particular case of an ancestor that was resuscitated,
rediscovered it,
right, rediscovered and resuscitated. People then perform the rites. They kind of the ancestors then kind of they're reborn, I guess, through the ritual, as you described as well.
Right.
And it strikes me that, even for the South Asians that I was researching among, Hong Kong is such a religious, the religiosity in Hong Kong is really thought, it's really celebrated among Tamils even and Hindus. A lot of people think of Hong Kong as a kind of container of religiosity, compared to the other side of China, other side of the border. It just, resonates there.
Very, very well put. Because even though among the Mon lineage that I studied in both the diaspora in London and also in Hong Kong, even those men who basically spent most of their productive life in London were, by comparison to what was happening across the border in China, were still relatively, quote, religious, in the sense that they had this tradition that they picked up as kids and as they knew as young adults. And when they retired, many of them retired and stayed in London, of course, or Amsterdam or Liverpool or Toronto or wherever they were. But they would come back periodically. And some of them were actually recruited to go across the border just a few miles and reintroduce to the Mon lineages that were across the border that had been, in which the ritual life had been just completely obliterated by the Red Guards and by the revolution, just completely gone. To revive some of the rituals, to teach them the kowtow, the bowing and the rituals and how to perform and how to treat the pig and all of that. And they became, for lack of a better term, ritual instructors. And I interviewed some of these guys, talked to them. I use the term interview, but I just talked to them. And they were really proud of the fact that they were able to do this and that they still remembered all this stuff from when they were kids. And they thought it was very important to revive some of these rituals. And so much of the ritual was revivified by these diasporics who were out in the world, but yet were able to come back and to restart the rites. They weren't what I saw when I first started, but they were very close. And the most important part were the tomb rites and the rebuilding of ancestral halls and the reconstruction of ancestral tablets. Because, of course, the Red Guards obliterated everything. They burned everything in sight, including all the wooden tablets. Everything was gone. So they had to try to find some way to, and also the genealogies, the written genealogies were gone. So they didn't know exactly who was in line. So some of the ancestral halls have generalized tablets that are then treated and revivified by ritual. So it's some work has been done. Some research has been done on this across the border. I've done a little myself, but the major project is yet to, the major work is yet to be completed. So there's a lot to be done. So the rites are not by any means dead. They're just transformed. They just keep morphing. Trucking. They keep trucking, as they would have said in the Berkeley of my youth. They keep moving. They keep moving along.
Absolutely. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us, Widdy, and talking about your paper,